If George Washington was destined to become the angel in the whirlwind of the American Revolution, it must be said that the role wasn't always an enviable one. In this episode of Born in Battle, the Commander-in-Chief's qualities of perseverance and self-control are tested nearly to the breaking point. In the aftermath of the Battle of Long Island, General George Washington once again confronted the conundrum of how to defend an island without a navy. Though he did what he could to secure his position, sinking several hulks in the Hudson, posting strong batteries along the shore, even stringing chain across the river, none of these strategies prevented British ships from coming and going whenever they pleased and the wind allowed. Indeed, his recent defeat on Long Island had only made the problem more maddening. First, he had lost Brooklyn Heights to the enemy, a position that he believed essential to holding New York from the outset. Second, although his army was no longer divided, it had been diminished by almost 1,500 men, and that was just the beginning of his losses. Shaken in spirit and increasingly convinced of the impossibility of holding the city, whole companies simply started hiking for home. Of the 8,000 Connecticut men in the army, 6,000 were gone inside a week. Worried that he might be cut off and trapped on Manhattan, Washington posted the better part of his remaining forces so as to protect his rear and keep open a line of retreat into Westchester. Nearly 10,000 troops were dug in on lines at Harlem Heights and King's Bridge at the northern end of the island. Another 5,000 were posted mid-island along the East River shore to oppose a landing there, while his best guns, with their crews, plus the remaining 4,000 of his infantry, were still on the battery at the southern tip. It may be that this was the best that could be done with an insoluble problem, but Nathanael Greene, recovered now from his fever, did not like the looks of it, and urged that the city be abandoned and burned to prevent its falling to the enemy. This Washington was not yet prepared to do, but his defeat and deliverance on Long Island had taught him to think anew about the broader nature of the problem. Decisive battle, he reasoned, was not the way to win this war. We should on all occasions avoid a general action or put anything to the risk, he reasoned, unless compelled by necessity, into which we ought never to be drawn. If America could simply protract the war, the British will to continue the contest might eventually be exhausted. It might be possible to win simply by not losing. Necessity, however, was about to compel Washington to fight. Having given the Americans a leisurely 2-week breather, the Howes sent 5 frigates up the East River on the night of the 14th of September, where they dropped anchor off Kip's Bay, opposite what is now 34th Street. In the hazy heat of the following morning, the 86 guns of the frigates smashed the flimsy earthworks constructed by the militiamen on the East River shore. Some of these men simply took to their heels, and those who remained peered through the clearing powder smoke to see a flotilla of flat-bottomed barges carrying 10 battalions of British light infantry and Hessian grenadiers. Their response was panic, immediate and nearly complete, which sent them hustling north up the Boston Post Road as fast as they could go. Part of the problem was simple inexperience, or the recent memory of the worst kind of experience. Some of those who fled their trenches had slogged across Gowanus Creek in a hail of gunfire 2 weeks earlier. The other part of the problem was a fundamental failure of leadership, for there was sufficient strength at hand and 5 regiments of reinforcements nearby to contest the enemy landings. But old William Spencer, the Connecticut Major General posted here, had no more command of the situation than the rawest country boy in the ranks. Nor could Washington do any better. Riding to the scene of this fresh disaster, he met the headlong mob somewhere in the neighborhood of modern 42nd Street and tried to rally them. But the sight of the approaching British light infantry just then was more inspiring than the presence of the tall Virginian. Now Washington, long known for his icy self-control, simply exploded into a towering, cursing, white-hot rage, striking officers and men alike with his riding crop as they surged past. "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" he shouted in despair. His rage spent, he now sat slumped in his saddle amid the detritus of a rout. Virtually alone, he was within moments of becoming a prisoner himself when an aide took his reins and turned the commander north to follow the retreat to Harlem Heights in stunned silence. Though Washington was in no frame of mind to contemplate good fortune, in fact, he was even then enjoying some luck. The British, having gained so much with so little effort, moved cautiously north in the wake of the flight from Kip's Bay, properly expecting an American counterattack. Moving up the east side of the island, they were inadvertently holding open an escape route on the west side for Putnam's 5,000 troops from the battery. Though forced to abandon his guns and stores, Putnam drove his men north with relentless energy. If Howe's pursuit, now reinforced by fresh landings, had turned aggressively westward, they might have crushed the flank of Putnam's strung-out column and perhaps driven the Americans into the Hudson River. In the end, it was a close thing, but Putnam's energy and Howe's caution decided the race in favor of the Patriots. By sundown, the whole of Washington's army, though whipped again, was digging in on Harlem Heights, while Royal Marines were raising the Union Jack in triumph over New York City. By dawn the next day, Washington was regaining some measure of composure. He wrote to Congress that he could win on Harlem Heights if Howe would attack and if his men would act with tolerable resolution. Even then, Thomas Knowlton, the tall Connecticut colonel who had held the rail fence on Breed's Hill, was taking the fight to the British, though his wasn't much of an attacking force, no more than 120 Connecticut Rangers in sum. They collided with the 42nd Highlanders, the famous Black Watch, and a couple of battalions of light infantry just south of Harlem Heights in a broad depression known locally as the Hollow Way. A sharp little firefight was ignited, and the two sides exchanged volleys on open ground until the weight of British numbers threatened to overwhelm Knowlton's tiny force, whereupon he broke off the fight and fell back in good order. The British, however, mistaking orderly retreat for another headlong rout, sent the light infantry forward in immediate pursuit, whooping and bugling contemptuous fox-hunting calls as they came. If this was arrogance on the part of the British, it was an opportunity for the Americans. Now Washington ordered Knowlton back into the Hollow Way, this time supported by 3 Virginia rifle companies. At the edge of a buckwheat field, a serious stand-up fight ensued, which succeeded in driving the light infantry back on the 42nd's lines. As the fighting surged back and forth over the next hour, Washington hustled 3 more outfits into the contest: Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maryland men, some of them the same militiamen who had fled so ingloriously from Kip's Bay. Then the seemingly impossible happened. The kilted Scots of the Black Watch, famed throughout the empire for their fearless combativeness, broke and ran back through the buckwheat. Only the timely arrival of Hessian grenadiers kept their retreat from becoming a rout, a deliverance not without a humiliating sting of its own. But for the Americans it was an extraordinary and expansive moment. As a Pennsylvania boy remembered, the pursuit of a flying enemy was so new a scene that it was with difficulty that our men could be brought to retire. They gave a hurrah and left the field in good order. For many, it was also a transformative moment. The men in the ranks began to feel a confidence in their own fighting abilities, and, perhaps just as important, confidence in their leadership. Though the redoubtable Knowlton and a hard-fighting Virginian, Major Andrew Leach, were killed early in the fight, Washington had handled his regiments with crisp and purposeful efficiency. He had provoked a fight, won a smart little skirmish, and broken off the fight on his own terms. "You can hardly conceive the change it has made," wrote Washington's adjutant, Joseph Reed. "The men feel a confidence which before they had quite lost." Although Washington would have to be satisfied by this brief check of the British advance, he did not entirely share Reed's confidence. He had thus far saved his army, but lost the city he had come to defend. Still, his Continentals had shown skill and spirit when properly led, both in Brooklyn and at Harlem Heights. But if he had to continue to rely in large part on militiamen, he wrote to Congress, only certain and irretrievable ruin lay ahead. General Howe was dug in opposite Harlem Heights on his front, and Washington looked for Admiral Howe to strike at Kingsbridge or Westchester in his rear with the first good following wind. As Washington wrote privately to his cousin, Lund Washington, in undisguised despair, "Such is my situation that if I were to wish the bitterest curse to an enemy on this side of the grave, I should put him in my stead with my feelings." But the Howes did not move on the first favorable wind. For a full month the British stood down, while the Howes spun out yet another peace initiative. This time their peace proclamation appealed directly to the American people with frank simplicity. A rebel could keep his head and his land by the prompt return to obedience to George III. If enough colonials came forward in the next 60 days, the Declaration of Independence might well go into the dustbin of history, and a permanent union of England and America would be established. In this effort, the Howes were not as naive as they might seem from this distance. It may be that they feared their political enemies back in London, Lord George Germain and his cabal in particular, more than they feared General Washington. Indeed, when news of the proclamation reached London at the end of November, Germain, in the time-honored way of stay-at-home politicians, scoffed at the Howes' sentimental way of making war. Germain's dearest wish was in fact to see heads roll in America. The ruthless confiscation of American lands, which would be sure to follow, would further empower him and enrich his friends. Again, in seeking peace by reconciliation, the Howes may have been thinking anxiously about the history lesson to be read in John Bull's other island, Ireland. There, a war of conquest, begun in the time of the Tudors, had displaced and dispossessed the native ruling class. The result was a long, fruitless agony for both conquered and conquerors, a bloody business that continues down to our own day. Thoughtful men might wonder how the ministry hoped to bring an entire continent peacefully and productively into the empire when it could not do so with the tiny island across the Irish Sea. Others might wonder what would happen to the British nation and its ancient constitution if the idea of liberty itself became a spoil of war. Although many discouraged Americans did come forward to declare their allegiance to the king, whatever hopes the Howes nourished for an immediate peace went up in flames on the night of the 20th of September, along with something like a quarter of New York City. Congress had in fact forbidden Washington to burn the city, and controversy and uncertainty have always surrounded this event. But the fires were set so simultaneously and spread so systematically that it is very difficult not to see an American fifth column at work. A south wind carried the flames of a dozen burning buildings throughout the city, and by the morning of the 21st, 500 or 600 Manhattan structures were in ashes. All Washington would say, rather disingenuously, was that Providence or some good honest fellow has done more for us than we were disposed to do for ourselves. As the city's fires smoldered out, several of those good honest fellows, including young Connecticut Captain Nathan Hale, certainly a spy and perhaps an arsonist as well, went to the gallows. But if Washington had denied some comfort to the British camp, he was no closer now to a real plan to turn back the British than he was when Nathanael Greene urged him to burn the city and retreat to Westchester back in high summer. By the 12th of October, the Howes, abandoning for the moment their peace initiative, were once more in motion, pushing warships and 5,000 troops up the East River, through the treacherous waters of Hell Gate, and on to Throg's Neck on the Long Island Sound. The Neck, however, was virtually an island, separated from the mainland by an unfordable stream and impassable marshes, and even a tiny detachment of Pennsylvania rifles under Colonel Edward Hand was enough to make Howe pause once more. 6 days later he pushed up the Sound to Pell's Point, determined now to force a landing that would put him on Washington's flank. But Pell's Point would be no Kip's Bay. A command there under tough old John Glover, whose Marblehead salts had helped row the army to safety after Long Island, now fought an agile and effective delaying action against 4,000 regulars before they won a narrow beachhead. 4 days later a column of Loyalists pushed on up the coast to Mamaroneck and collided, to their sorrow, with John Hazlett's Delaware Regiment, which drove them in disorder back on the main body of the British advance. It must have been a pleasant sight for Washington to see what American regulars could do against British militia for a change. But Washington was already resigned to retreat from Manhattan and to fall back on White Plains well up the Bronx River. On the 16th of October, the main body began sullenly and silently trudging north, painfully dragging their gear for want of horsepower and leaking a steady stream of deserters. As Washington pushed north, he left behind two large commands, nearly 3,000 men under Colonel Robert McGaw in Fort Washington on the Manhattan side of the Hudson, and 3,500 under Nathaniel Greene in Fort Lee opposite on the Jersey shore. The defense of these posts on the vital Hudson was the express will of Congress, and both McGaw and Greene believed they could be held. Such luck as Washington would enjoy in this episode was once more a gift from William Howe. The pursuit of the British was as leisurely as his own retreat was laborious. It was the 22nd of October before Washington reached the relative safety of the hills around White Plains, and Howe was not ready to press the issue until the 28th. For Americans still of hopeful mind, there was much to like about the White Plains position. Americans held the high ground, and the British, after posting a large garrison at New Rochelle, would actually be slightly outnumbered on the battlefield. Washington still had 14,500 men with the colors at this point, and Howe 14,000. But whatever advantage Washington had on the eve of battle, he was about to squander. The American line ran in an arc on 3 hills. The highest and rightmost of these was Chatterton's Hill. Unfortunately, as Howe was quick to see, it was also the most vulnerable. Barely more than 1,500 Americans held this hill, some battle-tested Delaware and Maryland Continentals, the rest battle-broken New York and Connecticut militiamen, survivors of the Long Island disaster. Then, too, Sir William Howe had moments when he demonstrated precisely why many held him to be the King's ablest soldier. He opened the contest for Chatterton's Hill with a smashing bombardment of its crest, then sent a combined force of 4,000 Hessian and British regulars splashing across the Bronx River and driving up the slope. Beaten back in the first assault, they reformed and returned to the attack, this time driving it home. The Hessians, reaching around to their left, began to turn the American flank at about the same time Howe sent the 17th Dragoons galloping up the hill in the first real cavalry charge of the American Revolution. At this point, the militiamen had seen enough, and more than enough. Their lines wavered and broke, and soon their fugitives were headed for the woods. Whatever hope the Maryland and Delaware regiments had of making another Breed's Hill here disappeared with the militia. But they left the field in good order, leaving on it some 300 British and Hessian casualties, 100 more than their own. Regardless of their steadfast stand and disciplined withdrawal, the plain fact was that the British possession of Chatterton's Hill exposed the main body of Americans, center and left, to destruction. Howe would never satisfactorily explain why he did not coordinate his attack on the American right with attacks all along their front, which was in fact his original plan, or even more mystifying, why he did not follow up a wounded adversary with aggressive pursuit. Again, having won half a victory, he stood down. One subordinate wondered whether incapacity or design was the source of Howe's inertia, and frankly suspected it was the latter. Regardless of his politics, from a purely military viewpoint, Howe had achieved precious little for his casualties. He held a hill of no particular value. There were nothing but hills from here to the St. Lawrence River. Meanwhile, the opportunity to destroy Washington's army had come and gone again. If he was waiting for Sir Guy Carleton's column from Canada to show up in Washington's rear, he would have to keep waiting. Benedict Arnold's doomed fight off Valcour Island 2 weeks before White Plains had caused sufficient delay to make Carleton reconsider a drive south with winter drawing on. Howe finally gave orders for Sir Henry Clinton to attack the White Plains line on the morning of the 1st of November. But on the last night of October, Washington led his men out of the lines and fell back northward in a dismal rain to the high ground of nearby North Castle. His army was on the run again, but it was still intact, and that counted for a great deal. It was also true, however, that his own inexperience and errors in judgment had put the army in mortal danger again. Much of his difficulty arose from the simple fact that he was bearing a responsibility no man could bear alone. Howe was an experienced hand with a responsive staff and able, aggressive field commanders. Washington, with no staff worthy of the name or field commanders on whom he could rely, was terribly alone. Indeed, in the weeks ahead his own subordinates would put him in as much peril as Sir William Howe. For his part, General Howe was not quite sure what his next move ought to be. With its flanks secure, Washington's Castle Hill line would be a tough nut to crack by frontal assault. On the night of the 4th of November, in the first snows of winter, Howe turned his army back south. Washington was quick to see that the British intended to bend their force against Fort Washington. General Charles Lee, who would cause Washington no end of mischief, at least began this phase of the campaign with perfectly good counsel. Forts Washington and Lee could not be held, and their garrisons and gear ought to be promptly withdrawn. Nor did it take an eccentric military genius to come to this conclusion. The purpose of the forts in the first place was to deny the British control of the lower Hudson, but the nearly unhindered passage of 3 warships up the river in the first week of November already demonstrated the futility of that effort. In command on the Hudson was Major General Nathaniel Greene, the Connecticut Quaker turned soldier. In time to come he would prove the ablest of Washington's lieutenants, but right now inexperience and overconfidence were leading him to disaster. Greene, sure that he could hold the posts, prevailed on Washington to let him try, much contrary to the commander's own better judgment. "I am inclined to think that it will not be prudent to hazard the men and stores at Fort Washington," he wrote to Greene, "but as you are on the spot, leave it to you to give such orders as to evacuating, as you judge best." If this was fatal indecision on Washington's part, it coincided with a nearly fatal division of his army. While Greene and Magaw prepared for the defense of the lower Hudson, Charles Lee and William Heath would remain in Westchester, roughly on the line of the Croton River, to defend the approaches to New England. Washington himself would cross to the west bank of the Hudson to bar the way to the Hudson Highlands through New Jersey. But the fate of the Hudson forts weighed heavily on his mind. He had ridden from Hackensack to inspect them on the 12th of November, and should perhaps have seen the particular vulnerability of his namesake fort. It was roughly a 5-pointed star, 230 feet above the Hudson, but still unfinished, and the outlying works encompassed more ground than Magaw's garrison could hope to defend against a determined British assault. Certainly William Howe saw its weakness, aided in large part by scrupulously detailed information provided by an American turncoat. While Washington rode anxiously back to his Hackensack headquarters, Howe sent out orders to seize the fort, and on the 14th of November, an attacking force of 8,000 British and Hessians in 4 divisions began marching under cover of darkness to their jumping-off points. The next morning Howe called on Magaw to surrender, but Magaw, at the close of a rather fulsome speech, vowed to fight to the last extremity. They were brave words, and indeed Greene continued to assure Washington that the men were in high spirits and ready to give the British a bloody repulse. Washington was not so sure. At dawn of the 16th, he mounted once more to ride to the forts for an inspection tour, dismounting at Fort Lee just in time to hear the opening gunfire of Howe's assault closing in on the fort from north, east, and south. Unlike Howe's attack at White Plains, this effort was precisely coordinated and effectively supported by artillery from both high ground nearby and on the river. Despite a steadfast effort by the Continentals in the outer works, they were too thinly manned to hold. When, after fierce fighting, a German regiment under Colonel Johann Rall broke through on the northern approach to the fort, the arc of the outer lines collapsed. But if the outer works were too thin, the fort proper was now too crowded for effective defense. 3,000 increasingly panicky men mobbed together with the British Navy at their backs and 4 divisions on their front. The dark day was drawing to a close when a German officer under a flag of truce demanded Magaw's surrender. If Magaw refused, he would storm the place and give no quarter. At this point, Magaw rightly supposed that this represented the last extremity he had spoken of, and surrendered. The loss was staggering. Although Magaw counted only 59 dead and 96 wounded on his rolls, some 2,800 were taken in the capitulation, along with irreplaceable guns, gear, and ammunition. Howe's losses were not inconsiderable, 78 dead and nearly 400 wounded, but this time they did not deter him from continuing the offensive. He now sent Cornwallis with a force of 4,000 to seize Fort Lee. The column crossed upriver under the guns of British warships at dawn of the 20th and marched in hot haste down the west bank. Cornwallis came within an ace of snatching the unfortunate General Greene himself, but Greene pulled his garrison out in time and drove them westward to join Washington, losing just 100-odd laggards. With Fort Lee in British hands, Washington's disaster on the Hudson was complete. As Washington wrote to his brother Jack, "I am wearied almost to death with the retrograde motion of things." And American fortunes could not have been much darker. Losing Manhattan and the Hudson forts was not even the worst of it. Since the clash on Long Island 3 months earlier, more than 300 officers and 4,000 men had been captured by the British. And owing largely to the loss of Fort Washington, many of these were Washington's ablest and best trained. Dead and wounded were reckoned at something like 600, and it was not possible to count with precision the number of deaths by disease, though that sum was certainly larger than all other casualties combined. An 18th century soldier, after all, got roughly the same level of medical care he would have received in the Middle Ages. Desertions increased apace as fought out, marched out, just plain disheartened men went home. In any case, many enlistments were up on the 1st of December, and virtually all the rest by year's end. Washington was watching his army fall apart in his hands. Congress had approved the recruitment of 80,000 men for the Continental Line after the Battle of Long Island, but the measure would not produce a single soldier in 1776. Since it gave power to the states to commission officers who would in turn recruit the enlisted men, long, laborious delay was inevitable. As for the quality of the officers being commissioned, Washington snorted, most were not fit to be shoeblacks. Indeed, the social composition of the Revolution was already beginning to change. Americans are much enamored of the myth of a homogeneous, classless Continental Army inspired by liberty and devoted to Republican virtue. But after the initial rage militaire passed and the brutal business of war dragged on, the ranks of the Continental Line were increasingly filled out by the landless, the unskilled, and the disenfranchised. They did not so much represent their communities as they lived precariously at their edges. Those who had most to gain from independence were in fact most reluctant to serve. The hardship of service and the terror of battle fell largely on those who had nothing to lose but their lives. Those still in the ranks with Washington toward the end of November, some 5,000, were on the run with Lord Cornwallis dogging their retreat. Cornwallis had youth, ambition, and a column of redcoats and Hessians 10,000 strong, and these professionals showed the kind of marching they could do when a real driver put them to it. Washington slipped out of Hackensack, crossed to the west bank of the Passaic River, and fled south into New Jersey. He reached Newark by the 28th of November, but there was neither safety nor respite here. Cornwallis's van was just tramping in as Washington's rear guard was trudging out. On they went in the sleet and the slop, headed now for New Brunswick, and the chance to put the Raritan River between them and Cornwallis's hounds. Precious few Americans would reach the Raritan. On the 1st of December, their enlistments up, 2,000 men decided they had had enough of soldiering and went home. And well they might, for even the British pitied Washington's gaunt, staggering column. As one officer remembered, many of the rebels were without shoes or stockings, and several were observed to have only linen drawers, without any proper shirt or waistcoat. Also in great want of blankets, they must suffer extremely. Washington's little band got a few days of rest behind the river, while Howe caught up to the pursuing column and paused to issue yet another proclamation offering pardons and protection. It must have seemed the briefest reprieve to Washington. Although New Jersey had some 16,000 militiamen on its rolls, and Washington had been calling for them since he first reached White Plains, almost no one was willing to join a doomed army in what seemed a hopeless cause. In the end, barely 1,000 turned out in New Jersey. Worse yet, if American affairs could get worse, Washington had been calling on his second-in-command, Charles Lee, to march to him at once with the rest of the army still at Peekskill and North Castle. These repeated dispatches Lee treated as interesting suggestions at best, and at worst with insolent insubordination. Indeed, having done little to injure the British, Lee was even now campaigning to overthrow Washington. Correspondence with Joseph Reed condemned what he believed to be Washington's fatal indecision of mind. To friends in Congress, Lee wrote openly that the crisis required a man of genius, himself, with dictatorial powers. He even opened a correspondence with Massachusetts officials. If they would create an independent army, he was willing to answer for their success. He forbore to mention that 5,000 Massachusetts men had already deserted his ranks on the Croton River. It was nearly the middle of December before Lee led what was left of his command into New Jersey to join Washington, and he was far from his own column on the 13th when a detachment of the 16th Dragoons caught up to him in a little tavern in Basking Ridge. After a brief scuffle, Lee and his staff were taken prisoners. Washington, a self-taught provincial, had hoped for much better from the professional Lee. What he got were base betrayal and blind folly. By the time Lee was taken, Washington was already on the south bank of the Delaware River opposite Trenton, having made good his escape from New Brunswick while General Howe was proclaiming peace and pardons. Having possessed himself of everything that could float on the Delaware River, he was able to keep the British at bay, but could do little else. Lee's column came in at last, without Lee, of course, in addition to a detachment of 500 down from Ticonderoga and another 1,000-odd militiamen up from Pennsylvania. Of the 20,000 with him in New York in high summer, he now counted barely 6,000, many of them, he reported, entirely naked and most so thinly clad as to be unfit for service. For all his outward calm, Washington admitted privately that unless he were reinforced and resupplied, and soon, the game will be pretty well up. In this game, Sir William Howe appeared to hold all the trump cards, though he was not yet certain how he wanted to play the hand out. Sir Henry Clinton had already argued for a bold move. He wanted to lead a strong column to the Chesapeake Bay. From the head of the bay, he would march for Philadelphia, while Howe with the rest of the army marched on the American capital from New Jersey. Washington would be caught between two fires, and Clinton was sure the rebels would lose their army and their capital. Panicky congressmen thought so too. They fled the capital for Baltimore in mid-December before a single redcoat appeared. Indeed, it is hard to see how Washington could have parried these two strokes, north and south. As it was, the only thing that stood between him and destruction now was the ice-choked Delaware River. If Washington had been privy to Howe's counsel, he might well have been grateful, for Howe refused to approve both this Clinton proposal and another that called for a landing in force on Washington's flank at Elizabeth or Amboy in New Jersey. The one move Howe was willing to make came at the insistence of his brother, the admiral, who wanted Newport, Rhode Island, as the winter haven for his fleet in the north. Accordingly, Clinton marched off to Newport with 4 brigades, and in cooperation with the fleet, took the place without undue difficulty in the first part of December. With that, Sir Henry Clinton, 1/3 of the original triumvirate of reputation who sailed on the Cerberus, returned to London to fight the battles of political intrigue.